BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday, and it is now the month of December, and for the Thursday show, I've been planning on doing a series of Zodiac AMAs. This is a series that I started in 2021, where I did a series of Zodiac videos, and then I looked at your questions and comments, and we went through the material together and had a discussion. And it came to my attention that certain Zodiac Killer suspects were not included in that AMA series, and one of them is Xenophon Anthony, and he will be the subject of today's episode. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Xenophon Anthony is a Zodiac Killer suspect that has not been talked about very frequently compared to some of the more famous suspects out there. It's really not until you get under the surface in the Zodiac world that you'll perhaps encounter the name Xenophon Anthony. But he does stand out from the other Zodiac Killer suspects for a particular reason. He still holds the claim of being the only Zodiac Killer suspect that can be placed at a crime scene at the time of death by an eyewitness. Yes, all of those things put together. Because the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The final confirmed crime that was committed by the Zodiac Killer was on October 11th of 1969 with the murder of Paul Stine, the taxi driver in Presidio Heights. And there are the Robbins kids who were eyewitnesses who provided the details for the composite sketch, who saw the Zodiac Killer leaving Paul Stine's taxi and wiping it down. But there was also an 8-year-old boy whose name has not been made available to the public, who did see the Zodiac and identified him as Xenophon Anthony, a man who lived in the local area. And did the 8-year-old eyewitness simply get mistaken because it was dark out, or did he actually correctly identify the Zodiac Killer? Let's go through this together, and I do want to be clear, other suspects can be placed at the crime scenes, but this is at the scene of the crime at the time of death by an eyewitness. For example, Richard Hoffman is a Zodiac Killer suspect. He can be placed at the Blue Rock Springs crime scene. He was the first police officer on site. Dennis Land is a Zodiac Killer suspect. He was a park ranger at Lake Berryessa, where the Lake Berryessa stabbing occurred. But Xenophon Anthony was placed at the scene of the crime by an eyewitness at the time of death. How much stock do you put into that? Let's have some background info on Xenophon Anthony before I get to your questions and comments. Xenophon Anthony was born in 1931 on January 28th of that year, and he passed away in 2016 on January 16th of that year as well. January 17th, excuse me. So, born on January 28th, 1931. That means that we're dealing with a 38-year-old Zodiac. His birthday would have occurred during the middle of Zodiac activity. For the majority of the time, he would have been 38 years old, and I think that's totally reasonable. That doesn't disqualify him. He's not too young or too old. Xenophon Anthony was born in Spokane, Washington, and he was a resident of the local Seattle area until 1949. Then he went to Harvard Business School, and he graduated from Harvard in 1953. He got married in 1956 and moved to San Marino, California. And citing his obituary here, he stayed in San Marino for 10 years before moving to San Francisco, and then ultimately he would have a career change. He would leave the business world, which was the retail wholesale business, and in 1976, Xenophon Anthony and his wife Valerie founded the Stern School, which was a school for children with learning differences. Okay, so Xenophon Anthony was living in the Bay Area at the time. Now, he was not only educated, he was also Harvard educated. So to all of those people out there who think that the Zodiac Killer misspellings were unintentional or the Zodiac simply couldn't spell words, Xenophon Anthony is probably not your guy. The Zodiac misspelled words like Christmas, and Merry Christmas, Merry Xmas, and the Zodiac misspelled words like Friday and kid. And Xenophon Anthony was a Harvard graduate. He could probably spell the words Christmas and kid. Now, maybe he did that intentionally. But I told you guys that I would look at some of the questions and comments that you guys had left on previous episodes. And our first one comes to us from James Lucenti, who says, I truly believe Xenophon was the Zodiac Killer. He put a Z at the bottom of his letters, and perhaps it was representing a very odd and uncommon first name which starts with X. It is pronounced Z. Okay, though, I think I know what you're talking about, and this might actually refer to the Bates Had to Die letters which were mailed in 1967, which were associated with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. And these letters are thought by some to have been hoaxes. More or less in 2021, Riverside PD came forward and said that a man stated that he hoaxed the letters in 1967. Not everyone accepts that, but I am fully aware that yes, the letter Z is put on the bottom of other Zodiac communications. The Halloween card very famously has the flying V symbol, the Z, and the Zodiac symbol, which some people think is a signature in and of itself. But there's also one piece of evidence that does not come from James Lucenti here. It comes from other people, and that is that when the Zodiac Killer mailed the mentioned Halloween card, on the inside of the envelope, the Zodiac Killer didn't leave one of his signature ciphers. Instead, he left the words, sorry no cipher, in the shape of an X. And some people think that he chose to do this because Xenophon Anthony's name begins with the letter X. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I don't like this type of thinking. I don't care for this type of thinking. Even if it turns out that Xenophon Anthony was the Zodiac Killer, that probably was not a signature. No matter who wrote that, that very clearly is just somebody writing the words, sorry no cipher, in the shape of an X because they intersect and it was going in an envelope. I don't really think that that is any direct signature of anybody's first initial, so I don't particularly like that at all. Now our next comment comes to us from Daniel Webster, and that is, one thing people cannot deny is that Xenophon Anthony was the only person identified in a crime scene. Now granted, it was an 8-year-old identifier, but my 8-year-old grandkids can generally identify who was knocking on their door, for example. But that's the whole issue. That's why we're still talking about him, because he was identified by somebody at the crime scene. And you guys might be wondering, how does he come into the mix of being a suspect? And how did people learn his name? Well, full credit goes to Alex, also known as Welsh Chappie, for getting the name revealed to the public. And he is someone who allowed us to have these types of discussions. And you might be also wondering some things about the story. Well, is this accurate? And in 2021, I was working on a different Zodiac Killer series, and that was the Debunked series. And I brought up a piece of contradictory evidence, and it was from an article from the publication called Crime and Time that stated that Xenophon Anthony was not actually seen at the crime scene. He was seen walking a few hundred yards away from the crime scene by the 8-year-old witness. And I was like, well, maybe that makes more sense. That's why he's not taken more seriously as a Zodiac Killer suspect. He wasn't seen at Paul Stein's taxi. He's seen in his neighborhood, maybe 300 or 400 yards away. But then Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com responded to me after I made that episode and said, no, you got to look at this section of the report. That article from Crime and Time was incorrect. And Welsh Chappie also was very keen to note that it's in the report that he was seen at the crime scene, not 300 or 400 yards away. I think that the people from Crime and Time were simply connecting the dots in a way that tried to make the narrative a little bit easier to digest. They were trying to connect the dots in a way where they could provide this explanation as to why this suspect was not taken more seriously. Because they're like, well, maybe he wasn't actually seen at the crime scene. No, it seems like he was. And here is something else that Richard Grinnell shared with me. And you guys can let me know what you think about this. I've gone on the record, and I've stated that out of all of the Zodiac Killer suspects, I think that Xenophon Anthony has the strongest amount of facial similarities to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, the ones that were done after the Stein murder. the head shape, the jawline, and particularly the nose. Although the most famous photo of him, the one that's used in the thumbnail of this episode, is one that was taken in 1949, 20 years before the Zodiac crimes. But even when you look at the older photo of him that was shared in his obituary, he still has a relatively similar facial shape. And, I mean, I said that he had the strongest resemblance to the Zodiac Killer composite sketch. And what Richard Grinnell suggested to me was, is it possible that this 8-year-old saw this person and was thinking that he has a very strong resemblance to Xenophon Anthony, that the 8-year-old eyewitness mistook the Zodiac Killer for Xenophon Anthony? Because, again, he wouldn't be up close and personal. He would be, a considerable amount of distance. He's looking at him from a house, and that he just mistook this person who had a similar appearance. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. I would love to read your responses. Some other evidence in favor of Xenophon Anthony being the Zodiac Killer come to us from an individual named C.G. Karras, who wrote one of my favorite Zodiac Killer books, The Zodiac, Murderers and Histories, Ciphers, and Crimes. And C.G. Karras has a very intricate way of involving Xenophon Anthony into the Zodiac Killer mystery, but one of the things that he is most famous for is proposing a solution to the Zodiac Killer's Z32 cipher. And the Z32 cipher is the one that says, the map coupled with this code will tell you where the bomb is set. You have until the next fall to dig it up. And then it said the solution to the cipher is 3218 Jackson Street, Xenophon Anthony. And you see that the X at the bottom of the Z32 cipher would also be a clue to Xenophon Anthony's real name. So credit to C.G. Karras for that as well. And I also want to confess to you guys that there is another person out there who has Xenophon Anthony as their Zodiac Killer suspect, and her name is Kelly Marshall. Kelly Marshall ran a YouTube channel called Just a Sleuth. I'm not sure if she's still uploading now, but in 2020 and 2021, she was uploading very frequently, looking at all of the possibilities that could connect Xenophon Anthony to the Zodiac Killer. And one of them was related to the Z13 cipher, and specifically, her solution involved looking at the central characters of the Z13, because the Zodiac Killer's Z13 cipher goes AEN, Zodiac symbol, 8, K, 8, M, 8, then there's the Aries NAM, and she proposed that the middle symbols, the K and the M, were the most important ones, because if you were to shift them by 13 symbols, both of them by 13 symbols, then they would go to the letters X and Z. Like the 13th letter of the alphabet would be M, and then that would, I guess, would make K the 11th letter of the alphabet. And if you were to shift them down the line, 13 symbols, you would have an X and a Z for Xenophon Zodiac. I don't particularly like that solution to the Z13 cipher, and I also just had the giant question myself. Why would this only be his first name and only the word Zodiac, Xenophon Zodiac? Why not his full initials, Z? Well, I guess this would be X, A, and Z. How hard would it have been for the Zodiac Killer to insert the letter A in the middle of that, where you would have K, A, and Z? And I know you can't necessarily shift the letter A 13 symbols unless you're going with some type of circular motion. But again, this is just Xenophon Zodiac. That doesn't contain the name Anthony. It doesn't contain his middle name either, which was Lusby. So I have some very, very big problems with using that method. But I also will confess to you that over the last month, I've been going through the Just a Sleuth videos, and Kelly Marshall became famous in 2020 for releasing her own documentary, Zodiac Rush to Editor. And a lot of people were thinking that she had solved the 340 cipher. This was about 3 or 4 months before David Orenchak, Jarl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake solved the 340 officially. And Kelly Marshall had her own way of solving the cipher, and that was to take the 408 cipher and the 340 cipher on transparent overlays, like paper where you could see the symbols, or maybe even plastic where you could see the symbols, and you place the transparent overlays on top of each other. Then you turn the paper to a certain level, to a certain angle, and it reveals the solution. My name is Tony. Another one she found was Rush to Editor. And also, she also found the X and the A together for Xenophon Anthony. But again, I'm not impressed with just finding two letters that are useful to a suspect's initials. But the My Name is Tony thing was something that she was taking to the bank. But you also might be wondering, his name wasn't Anthony, his name was Xenophon. Anthony was the surname, so going by Tony would be a very odd nickname. And this is one that I haven't talked about before on the channel, but it appears that Kelly Marshall just started finding any excuse to use the name Tony and link him to Xenophon Anthony. Because the 340 was solved, and then we had, in chronologically speaking, the Zodiac mails the 340 in 1969, but in 1971, the Zodiac also mailed something called the Pines card. And Kelly Marshall made a video on the Pines card where she also thinks that someone left a signature using the name Tony, and I'm going to play the video clip for you now. It's about 90 seconds long, but I'll just play that and respond.
I just got this magazine. I got it a couple days ago, and I got it for a specific reason. Just researching some things from San Francisco from 1969. So this is September 23rd, 1969, Look magazine. Diana Ross is on the cover. You guys will not believe, I'm just flipping through, just looking, and of course, you know, the ads, whatever. Let me get to the point right here. The tree on the far right is Ralph, okay? Here is an advertisement, and what do you know what it's for? Boom. I knew I recognized that. What do we see down here? These home sites available at Incline, and anyone that follows the Zodiac Killer case knows that he had sent the Incline Village letter. Whoa, check out this first paragraph. This little pine is called Peter. Each of these trees has a name thanks to Tony. Unreal. Unreal. That is why he sent it. His name is Tony. Thanks to Tony. Wow. Y'all, I'm just blown away. I just saw this, so I'm a little speechless right now. And I wanted to record so you could get my raw emotions, because you're probably saying holy shit too. All right, I will finish this in a minute.
And once again, that was from Kelly Marshall and the channel Just a Sleuth. And she was heavily criticized for this video, where she's also, or people are calling her out. And they're just saying, hey, just because you found the name Tony in a magazine does not mean that the Zodiac Killer's Pines card was authored by somebody named Tony. Furthermore, Xenophon Anthony's name wasn't Tony, his name was Xenophon, and he went by the nickname Zine, spelled X-E-N but pronounced Zine, from what I've gathered. So, just because you find the name Tony here and there, in not even a Zodiac communication, this is in a news article, a magazine article, saying these trees are done thanks to Tony and they have a connection to Incline Village. And she's calling it the Incline letter, but really this is the Pines card. We call it the Pines card, the peek through the Pines card. That is not sufficient evidence. And that is also something that I just simply do not care for. But in terms of the 340 Cipher, Kelly Marshall continued to make videos after David Oranchak's solution was approved by the FBI. Not only was she saying that, she thought that her solution was correct, she was still saying that she solved the 340 Cipher, and she disputed the findings of the FBI. And I think that there could have been two ways to go about this. One way could be that, all right, I understand David and Jarl and Sam's solution. I think that theirs is pretty good, but I think that mine is more accurate. The whole thing with the transparent overlays turning to reveal the message, the cipher is the key itself. But that's not what she did. She did the second thing, where she simply said, no, I solved the 340 Cipher, and the FBI just wouldn't listen to me. And that is also something that is very suspect, because it raises a certain amount of concerns. It's almost as if you will not accept evidence to the contrary if it doesn't fit your narrative. And to be honest with you, I think that the solution provided by David, Jarl, and Sam is more accurate. The one that says, "I hope you're having lots of fun trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show." I think that that's the correct solution to the 340 cipher. But we have a comment that came in on a previous Xenophon Anthony episode from Pablo, who says, "Kelly Marshall's interpretation of the code still is the most interesting to me." And this is a recent comment. This one actually came out just a little while ago. "Many people claim that they crack the code in different ways and there's no solution. And that's the problem with the ciphers. If you don't know the key, you can solve the cipher any way you want because some signs will align." I totally accept that. I totally accept that. But with the 340 solution that was proposed by David Orenchak, so many things line up. Esoteric Zodiac language, Zodiac Killer misspellings like paradise spelled Paradice, partnered with the contemporary reference of "that wasn't me on the TV show," which happened after the Zodiac appeared on the Jim Dunbar show. And yes, the 340 was mailed after the appearance on the TV show. That is all in perfect alignment. That's telling me that David Orenchak's solution is most likely correct. Now we have a comment here from Grunge 90s Music, who says, "The Zodiac would most likely use other people's names if he didn't want to get caught. He could have easily looked up random people's names and included them in the puzzles. If he didn't want to get caught, sure. So then why is he using the name Tony? And furthermore, I mean, what is the relevance of this Tony? How does Tony fit into everything here?" So I think that that is also just throwing some doubt on these cipher solutions that are involving Tony. Now, this is a comment here from Blackadder X, who says, "I get it, dude, but debunk a suspect with evidence. The truly strange thing is all the circumstances that pull a lot of people as suspects into the mix, as well as the case of JonBenet Ramsey. There were lots of links to many people that could have been the killer. It is truly strange." Well, in the Xenophon Anthony episode, I've already apologized for misstating that information or sharing that incorrect information from Crime and Time. And I quoted them almost verbatim. It turns out they were the ones who had made an error, and then I shared the error, so I'm still at fault. But in terms of evidence, I mean, I think I provided some reasonable challenges to Xenophon Anthony as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I will also share something with you. I think the Zodiac Killer suspects are absolutely different than the JonBenet Ramsey suspects. I think that those suspects come onto the radar for very different reasons. And earlier this year, I did a regular series about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, and then I'm hoping to restart that series very soon, perhaps after Christmas. And then once again, you can tune in every Tuesday for an episode about JonBenet Ramsey, and every Monday about the Zodiac Killer. As always, hit the like button and subscribe. Now we have one here from No Name Indicated, who says, "Xenophon Anthony was ID'd by name by an eyewitness. How is it that this bonehead thinks that's not a matching description?" I think that's a matching description. If you're calling me and saying that I don't think that that happened, I mean, I already told you in this episode, I think Xenophon Anthony has the closest facial similarity to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch out of any of the major suspects, out of any of the widely discussed suspects. If you were to put a pair of glasses on him, I think he would be a perfect match for the 1969 composites. And to respond to a different comment from Big Wave, who left this one on a recent episode that was not a Xenophon Anthony one, but he was talking about a colorized version of the composite sketch that I share frequently here on BBOR, and it was actually made by Chad Burke. He's the one who did the colorizations, and credits to Chad for that. And he said, "Why are you sharing this blonde image of the Zodiac Killer when the Zodiac Killer was reported to have had dark brown hair?" Well, there are a couple different descriptions of the Zodiac Killer. Firstly, Mike Mageau said reddish brown, almost with some curls. Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa, who saw the Zodiac Killer without his hood on, did indeed say that he had the dark brown hair. She saw him from a substantial distance, and she couldn't make out any discernible features, but she was saying that he was a Caucasian male with brown hair. I completely grant you that. But you also have Officer Falk giving a reported an alleged sighting of the Zodiac who said that he may have had some hair graying in the rear. I think, and this is just my guesswork, but I think that this sketch was colorized with blonde hair because when you look at the Zodiac Killer's composite sketches, it's almost drawn in a way to indicate that this person had light-colored hair. I mean, it's not hard to make a composite with dark brown hair. Look at the Lake Berryessa Voyeur, for example. That one clearly has a head of dark hair. This one, the composite sketch was drawn to feature light-colored hair, and I think that's why Chad chose to draw it that way. But I just want to look at some other things here. And some people are pointing out that there is another Zodiac Killer suspect out there named Shel Cavalli, who is the suspect of Microdeli amongst others. And if Shel Cavalli is given consideration for being a suspect and lived in Presidio Heights at the time, then why not give credit to Xenophon Anthony as well, who was a suspect who lived in Presidio Heights and also has a direct connection to the crime scene? And then we have another comment here from the Bay, San Francisco. And this says, "Hi Ned, my question is, do you think there is a chance that Donald Hardin was the Zodiac all along? Some killers involve themselves in a case and used to think the Zodiac was a cop for a long time, but Hardin is a suspect." And this one came in on the Xenophon Anthony episode, but it's asking about Donald Hardin, the man who solved the 408 cipher with the help of his wife, Betty. And no, I don't think that Donald Hardin was the Zodiac. I think it's exactly what they said it was. I think that Donald Hardin was a civilian sleuth who helped solve the 408 cipher, and him and his wife did it. And just because someone has a role in the case does not mean that they had anything to do with the murders. And when you look at a suspect like Xenophon Anthony in comparison and contrasting, Xenophon Anthony was actually ID'd by a witness at the crime scene. So that is way, way above just being part of the team that solved the cipher. Somebody has to solve the cipher if we get the solution. If we get the solution, that means some person was involved in the process. Therefore, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is any guilt. And as far as making, though, content about Xenophon Anthony online, I did get one comment from Kelly Marshall, who responded to my video when I was discussing her cipher solution, and I was actually trying to get her on the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Expert series, because even though I disagree with a lot of her observations, she still made content about that. And at the time, it was before we interviewed Ann Penn for that series, we didn't have a female participant, and I also just wanted someone from a different perspective, and I said that, hey, did you hear from the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Expert series? And she just said, somebody messaged me, but I didn't really look. And I was like, okay. And then we have one from F. Nargle who says, "It's funny looking back at these. It's the key to everything. Turns out it doesn't really have anything in it." And that's just it. You can make solutions to the cipher that are going to fit. You can make solutions to the ciphers that make sense to you. That does not directly mean that somebody has proposed a solution that is accurate. And that doesn't mean that it's what the Zodiac Killer was thinking when these crimes were committed. And I also want to let you guys know that there is that book that I mentioned, The Zodiac, Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes by C.G. Karras, that talks about Xenophon Anthony as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And I wanted to pick it up again because he is included in a 4-person team of Zodiacs, plural. And thankfully, when I did my book discussion on the Zodiac, Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes, I had bookmarked a page about Xenophon Anthony and his involvement in possible Zodiac activity. Once again, full credit to C.G. Karras. These are his observations, and he believes that the Zodiac was a 4-person team of Xenophon Anthony, Lawrence Kane, George Caradanis, and Hugh Penn. And it almost seems like George Caradanis was the most influential member, and then Lawrence Kane was maybe the biggest enforcer, and Xenophon Anthony may have been somewhat of the fall guy. But on the page that I had bookmarked in that book, it states that he believes that Xenophon Anthony and Lawrence Kane were responsible for the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966, and that they accosted her, and it was a 2-person effort. It took 2 people to subdue Sherry Jo Bates. But then in 1968 and 69, the Zodiac murders were actually committed because of a drug corridor. It was a CIA operation to keep a drug corridor open, and that's why David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were shot. And he does believe that Xenophon Anthony was one of the participants in that shooting, but maybe not the gunman. He may have assisted in accosting the victims, but not the gunman. And then, the murder of Darlene Ferrin was actually committed by Richard Gaikowski in his book and his theory, and that is that after the murder of Darlene Ferrin and the shooting of Mike Michaud at Blue Rock Springs, the Zodiac picks up the phone and he says, if you go 1 mile east on the Columbus Parkway, you'll find 2 kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I'm the one who did it. I also killed those kids last year. And then the famous goodbye. And what C.G. Karras is thinking is that if that were Richard Gaikowski murdering Darlene Ferrin, whom he had a problem with, then this has just connected Blue Rock Springs to Lake Herman Road. This was somebody committing a murder and just saying something to distract the authorities. But it turned out that this person was actually interfering with this CIA drug corridor operation. So then, the Zodiac persona was launched where somebody can take credit for this and make people realize that, hey, whoa, don't investigate anything about Blue Rock Springs and Lake Herman Road, but for anything other than just there's a serial killer on the loose. It's a distraction. It keeps people away from anything CIA related or drug related. Then you would have the Lake Berryessa stabbing committed to further this particular theory. And in this one, it's my understanding that this may have been committed by Lawrence Kane, and then George Caradanis is the one who wrote the message on the car door. But then you also have Xenophon Anthony possibly being a participant in Lake Berryessa as well. But one of the most interesting aspects of this book, The Zodiac Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes, is that with the Stein murder, you would have 2 people in the back of Paul Stein's taxi. Not 1, but 2, and they would be George Caradanis and Xenophon Anthony. And George Caradanis committed the murder of Paul Stein and then exited the taxi, and Xenophon Anthony stayed behind to wipe it down. And that's why he was the one who was witnessed by the Robbins kids, and he was the one who was witnessed by the 8-year-old who saw him near Paul Stein's taxi. And then he's the one walking away, and he was the fall guy. So he became the person who ultimately got blamed for most of this. Well, anyway, you can let me know what you think about that particular theory. And as I've said before, I think the book, The Zodiac Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes, is one of the most thoughtful books out there. It has a lot of ideas that go well beyond the suspects. And I particularly liked C.G. Karras' attention to some of the Greek symbols that could have been used, and you have the Greek name Xenophon and the Greek names Geocaradanis as well, and some of that stuff is absolutely fascinating. I have a book discussion on the Zodiac Murderers in History, Ciphers, and Crimes, but I just wanted to share that stuff with you guys here. What do you think about anything that has been discussed in this episode? What do you think about Xenophon Anthony as a Zodiac Killer suspect? Do you put any weight into the eyewitness who saw him, the 8-year-old eyewitness? What do you think about that video clip from Justice Luth about how Xenophon Anthony was the Zodiac Killer and he's inserting the name Tony into various parts of, well, everything, planting trees and naming them after people, and it's all because of Tony, and he wanted to get his name in the magazine, and he put the name Tony in the cipher in multiple places. What do you think about that? And did you hear anything that particularly caught your attention in this theory? Let me know anything you want in the comments section down below. You guys know where to write the show. blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And, of course, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And these pages are used to release shorts and reels Monday through Friday, mostly talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. You can also see the images that go by on the screen. They are archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook. True Crime Designs. This show is available for free downloads anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify, under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that is all for me now. And I will see you guys tomorrow for a new episode about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.